Team 1, prepare to move in 60 seconds. Final checks. Reltigix quickly inspected his gear while pressed against the wall of the target house. Plasma rifle, fully operational. Body armor, online, and all systems functional. Comms, no issues. Night vision gear, definitely working. He'd be as blind as a bat without it, as the humans like to say. A SWAT team member took position opposite Reltigix, gripping a massive battering ram in one hand, with an assault rifle strapped to his back. Among the heavily armed officers, Reltigix stood out like a sore thumb. For eyes, dark blue skin, and advanced armor made him look out of place. But then again, none of them had even a fraction of the tech he was equipped with. So who's the real winner here? Actually, when he thought about it, probably not him. At least the SWAT guys wanted to be here. Reltigix didn't, not in the slightest. For one thing, he hadn't really chosen to stay on this planet for the past 4 years, which was obvious enough. If everything had gone according to plan, he'd be back on Siginfax, relaxing in his old apartment, with Earth safely under the rule of the Drakian Galactic Imperium, never having to think about it again. But nothing had gone as planned. The humans had won, and decisively at that. Afterward, they rounded up the Drakian POWs and offered them a choice: apologize and integrate into society, or spend the rest of their lives in prison. Reltigix's choice was clear: 15 seconds. Unfortunately, not everyone had taken the same path. Some Drakians had pretended to apologize, only to turn around and try to wage a hopeless war against 7 billion humans with whatever scraps they could scrounge up. Before Reltigix knew it, terrorist attacks were making headlines every other night, and shortly after, he'd been voluntold to help deal with the situation. "Go, go, go!" Commander Nash shouted, as if the radio wasn't there or something. The officer with the battering ram set to work, while the others braced themselves. When it was sufficiently damaged, he stepped back, clearing the way for Reltigix to kick the door open and charge in, rifle at the ready. Immediately, Reltigix's night vision gear came of use, giving him a near-perfect view of the living room he had just entered. There was a Drakian on his right, with just a knife, as well as another Drakian crouched behind an overturned chair and clutching a revolver. They fired, the bullet pinging harmlessly off of Reltigix's combat armor, while Reltigix fired off a plasma lance, hitting the shooter in the arm and taking them out of action. The other Drakian, clearly assuming the target was a more squishy one, attempted to jam a knife into Reltigix's shoulder blade. This was responded to by Reltigix jamming his elbow into their stomach, followed by a kick, and finally a fist straight into the face. Room clear. 2 hostiles down. The officer behind Reltigix shouted over the radio, before advancing into the next room with yet more trailing behind him. A short burst of rifle fire announced the discovery of more Drakians, followed by another announcement on the radio. "Hostile down, room clear." Reltigix took some handcuffs from an equipment pouch, fastening them around the hands of the revolver user. Glancing at the man's arm, he could see the lance had burnt right through, while a burn completely surrounded the impact site, thankfully stretching just a few centimeters beyond. Back in the Drakian Stellar Imperium, treating that would be no real problem, and you'd be back to normal within a few hours. With the stuff available here, well, they had learned a lot from what they could scavenge, but that didn't mean reverse-engineered equipment was everywhere yet. It took time, and unless this guy got to go to a top-tier hospital, he'd be taking a slightly longer route to recovery. Reltigix, get in here. Look at all this. Looking up, Reltigix found Commander Nash gesturing to him. He nodded and got up to follow him inside, leaving the prisoner to be attended to by a proper medic. What is it? He walked through the door to find himself in a kitchen, except it wasn't a kitchen anymore, rather a bomb-making laboratory. Components of explosives dotted the cabinets and tables. A single Drakian was surrounded by a ring of guns on the floor, as a series of bandages were applied to the bullet wounds on him. Reltigix noted the presence of what looked like several nail bombs in a box. For people who hate humans, they really do love to copy all their weapons, don't they? He thought to himself. Exactly like you predicted. Looks like they might have been connected to that mall bombing the other week. Of course it's just like I predicted. If I couldn't predict right, I wouldn't be here, would I? Possibly. We should probably clear out and let the investigators in. Agreed. Well done, everyone. That was perfect. Have we found anything else yet? Leads on other cells. Reltigix was sat in the back of a SWAT Bearcat now, watching as the Drakians were loaded into ambulances or police vans. Commander Nash sat opposite, a flask of coffee in his hands. Nada, but that's not surprising. Again, looks like you were right. These were the last cell east of the Mississippi, which means we're pretty much done. Want some? Nash gestured to his flask. No, I don't do coffee. Can't stand most of your drinks, to be honest. Heh, maybe that's why there's so many of these terrorists about. Can't stand our food, one of the many SWAT officers mulling around commented, a remark that elicited a chuckle from his peers. Would make a lot of sense. Just to confirm, though, I'm free to go back? Reltigix decided to take it back on track. Hold on. Got something on my phone. The team commander pulled a phone out of one of his pockets. Reltigix was pretty sure that wasn't allowed to be there, but he got the feeling it wasn't worth pursuing anyway. Some emergency alert. Says some trash about inbound pods. I got that earlier as well. A different officer, the same one who had led the way into the kitchen, answered back. Never seen anything like it. Me too. The same team member who had been responsible for that quip before added their bit. What was it with some humans, and always wanted to have their chance to butt in? Probably some BS, like that one in Hawaii a few years ago. James, how long ago was that? How should I know? Another, presumably James, replied. You're the history guy. Medieval history, not that happened recently. Tom, it was 7 years ago now. There's your answer. Another voice, a woman's this time, joined the conversation. And what if it isn't some BS? More and more people were talking, and Reltigix could hear some hushed whispers between team members. Then we'll kick their back, just like the contact war. That's what. But it won't be. $5 says some dumb sat on the emergency button, and now he's panicking about how to turn it off. Reltigix, what was it you said before I got distracted? Oh, yeah, you're done 100%. We'll have you flying back to England by the end of the week. England was now Reltigix's home, as it was for most of the Drakian population on Earth. Of course, you could find Drakians all over the world at this point, having had a few years to travel and resettle, but only Britain had a sizable enough population to make meeting others a regular occurrence. And, am I getting paid for this? Yes, but I think they're routing it through the Brit Army, because you are on their orders to be here, so it'll take a while. Funny thing is, you get overt dash. Reltigix never heard what that funny thing was, because the commander cut himself off in the middle of his sentence. A bright white had filled the sky, completely and totally blinding this late in the night, forcing Reltigix to shut his eyes quickly. A single word flashed across his mind, nuke. He got out of the vehicle and dived into a small dip in a nearby lawn, awaiting further blasts, quickly followed by the rest of the SWAT team. Another series of flashes followed, which Reltigix counted as 3 more. His training began to kick in, half-remembered sections of textbooks from basic training, and a few hours in a simulator. Every soldier, in any truly interstellar army, was expected to be able to identify nuclear weapons effortlessly. And while it had been quite a few years since basic, there was still a little left in the corners of his mind. The sound of the first explosion finally arrived, giving him enough info to start mental maths. Sound taking that long means about 20 kilometers. Flash came from the west. That loud and bright means probably 1 megatons? For so far, Drakian Navy uses 3 warheads per missile, so maybe 2 MERS. First round 2/3 intercepted? Nothing left to intercept them on the second round, obviously. Everyone, report in, Nash shouted, just before the sound of the second wave of nukes hit. All good, sir. No injuries. But my eyes feel ready to fall out. The rest of the team concurred, glad that the onslaught appeared to be over. Where did they hit? What is going on? Nash shouted, seemingly looking for his phone. Think they hit the Capitol, sir. Jesus Christ. Reltigix. Is this your people? I think so, sir. It had matched the emergency alert, assuming that wasn't an error. If they're launching nukes here, that means a landing is likely. We consider that standard tactics for peer-grade militaries, which means they're taking Earth more seriously. Son of a... Okay, right, everyone listen up. Our best bet is Air Force Base. There's bound to be someone left to call shots over there. We've got guns and vehicles. That's enough to be of use to somebody. We won't be able to do any good trying to go into the city without Geiger counters or whatever. What about the prisoners, sir? James asked, his helmet off and a pale look on his face. We're still taking them with us. Looks like they're officially POWs again, not criminals. Pontique, South Korea. Sergeant Reynolds was having a bit of a bad day, as the Army's technical term went. He'd started the day off doing some good old maintenance on his tank. Better not run. Then he got rushed into a briefing room to get told that there was a war on. Then ordered into his tank because they'd worked out one of the Drakian landing pods was due to land nearby. And finally, he'd been ordered to attack it. Before those inside the pod managed to establish their foothold and begin pushing out. Hurry up and wait. More like, hurry up and die? He needed to work on that line. We're really doing this, aren't we? They're really here. PFC Anderson was shaking a little, sat in the loader's chair. Unlike the rest of the crew, this was his first time in combat, having been a civilian during the Contact War, which, come to think of it, should probably start being called the First Drakian War right about now. Look, Anderson, no time to worry now. Load Sabo. Anderson nodded, opening the ammo storage door and withdrawing around to load. Up, he shouted back. Remember, just stick to our training and we'll be fine. That it was a bit of wishful thinking on Reynolds' part. He had no real idea how this would go. This time, it looked like the Drakians been smarter in their preparations. Looks like 6 tank analogs, plus a platoon worth of IFEs. That was the gunner, SGD Jones, sat directly in front of Reynolds. Reynolds liked to think of him as one of the best gunners in the whole U.S. Army. Though, considering all the tech a tank sported these days, individual skill was certainly not as important as it used to be. Reynolds decided to take a close look at the enemy's tank design, fiddling with the optics a little. Wheels, suppose that makes sense for them. They probably fight in a lot of cities. Very short barrel. Maybe means a different type of main gun. Extremely low profile. So they could have automated it up a lot. Not sure that's the way I'd build a tank, given their tech, but hey-ho, I'm just a human. A section. Target the tank on the far right. Designated Target 1. B section. Take the tank next to it. That's Target 2 and so on. Once these are down, we'll push on to the landing site and crush it. Sooner we have these ones out, the sooner we can get a proper grasp of the situation. Onwards, the voice of the platoon leader, Lieutenant Steve, came over the radio, giving some guidance to the charge. They were bringing a company up against the Drakians, which meant 2 tanks to every enemy tank. Jones, you on target? Yep. Fire on LT's order. We'll coordinate. This is just a screening force while they unload from their lander. No point trying to tease out their capabilities. Muller, keep us going. Better not run, rumbled past a pair of burnout Drakian tanks. Their crews nowhere to be seen. A series of Hellfire missiles had gotten to them before Reynolds could have something he was thankful for. After all, it had shown the tanks could be killed, albeit they didn't know how much they needed at minimum. The Apache crew responsible had simply fired enough off before reporting a pair of explosions. Open fire. Lieutenant Steve order echoed through the radio headset, and almost instantly after, the gun thumped out a reply. The round shot away towards its target, Reynolds watching its progress all the way. The LT shot got there first, provoking a bright blue translucent wall that the round smacked against. Then Jones's shot hit, the wall not appearing this time, and enabling the depleted uranium round to burrow its way through the thick armor of the Drakian tank. It didn't seem to explode, however, suggesting the armor was more than a little tough. What was that? Jones shouted through his headset, glancing over to the left. Reynolds could see Anderson already reloading the 120 millimeters, sliding around into the breach. Some kind of Star Wars garbage. Our round hit. We must have overwhelmed it with that first shot. So keep firing. The Drakian tanks turned their turrets onto individual tanks, locking a barrel on. Reynolds waited for them to belch a round out, but none appeared. Then the report started coming through the radio. Torres' tank is down. Hostiles blew it up. Jones fired again as a platoon sergeant yelled to the rest of the platoon, hitting their target once more. It exploded in a nice, visually satisfying manner. All units be advised. Drakians appear to be deploying some sort of laser weapon. Optics of tanks that survive are busted. The LT shouted back, before his tank fired at their original, now deceased target. A volley of Hellfire missiles shot overhead, eliminating 2 more tanks. Must have managed to get more Apaches airborne then. Target 3 is still here, sir. All others eliminated. Push on then. Ignore the IFVs unless they are firing at you. Air support will handle them. The range kept decreasing. The situation even more chaotic. There was no synchronization to the battle at this point. Shells flew one way and plasma blasts off the IFVs flew back. Jones let off another round, this time blowing Target 3 up, marking an end to the major threats on the battlefield. The Apaches opened up with their chain guns, letting 30mm shells burst over the IFVs. One blew up, the other 2 rapidly catching fire, and their disembarked passengers fared little better. Keep pushing. Once we reach the pod, orders are total annihilation. We'll fire our machine guns until empty, use canister. Everything we have. Either we kill until we're stopped, or they'll surrender, whichever comes first. Reynolds announced over the tank's intercom. Grim order, but I have to say it nonetheless. Muller kept the speed up. While Jones fired off a final round at a nearby IFE, it's burning wreck now to their rear. I'm seeing a lot of Drakians moving about. Looks like some tanks parked up. They're still unloading stuff. We've caught them at just the right time. Load canister. Anderson, get to work with your 7.62 when you've loaded it. Reynolds gave the order, before opening the hatch and taking hold of the .50 cal. He picked out a small group of infantry, about company size, who appeared to be in the process of running towards cover and opened fire. Small puffs of dirt erupted in the ground alongside them, and a handful fell to the ground. Normally, they'd get back up, their armor being tough enough to take a hit or 2. But that was what the Apaches were around for, chain guns working to cut the company down to size. The main gun thumped out a canister round, blasting hundreds of tiny tungsten pellets towards the company. Within a few seconds, the infantry had completely disintegrated, the survivors alive purely by sheer chance. Any sense of order remaining on the battlefield evaporated, as Drakians scattered, desperate to make sure they weren't in a large enough group to make themselves a target. The crew of Better Not Run shifted focus again onto the parked-up tanks. Their crews seemed to be making an attempt to get them running, and they couldn't exactly let that happen. A few bursts of machine gun fire from the coaxial forced them to the ground. Then a series of artillery shells began to rain irregularly upon the battlefield, further adding to the chaos. Reynolds was in the process of swinging his .50 cal around to fire on a Drakian crawling towards his tank, when he witnessed a 155mm shell land inside the turret, passing through an open crew hatch before detonating. It set off a chain reaction, blowing up the nearby tanks in a spectacular display. I'm seeing hands in the air, staff, just on our right. Reynolds looked forwards, and sure enough, one small group had stuck their hands in the air, cast their weapons aside, and decided to take their chances. All right, don't fire on them. Hopefully the others will get the message. Just out of the corner of his eye, Reynolds spotted a Drakian tank attempting to roll down the ramp of the landing pod. only to have several holes punched into its side before it could even turn to face the attackers. That gave Reynolds an idea. "Muller, take us up that ramp. Get us a line of fire into the pod." Immediately after the order was given, Better Not Run broke towards the looming pod, which sat in a massive impact crater. Reynolds fired off another few dozen rounds, before stopping to watch the situation unfold. Tanks were crossing the battlefield purely at random, hunting down whichever target presented itself at that moment in time. The Apaches had taken up position, scanning the ground with their guns and blasting anything that dared to resist. It almost made Reynolds feel bad for the Drakians. Then he remembered that the capital was currently an irradiated pile of rubble, and he gripped the trigger again. If they wanted sympathy, they had to surrender. "Anderson, load canister. Jones, be ready to fire a shot off when we're coming up the ramp. If whoever's in command realizes we can threaten the ship itself, chances are he might order them to give up." Anderson nodded, ducking down into the turret to grab a round from the ammo compartment. Loaded, Muller made a turn, bringing Better Not Run parallel with the crater. Now, looking out of the turret at it, Reynolds could truly appreciate the sheer size of the landing pods. In an academic sense, he'd already understood it, of course, but reading it in a book and seeing it were simply not the same. Longer than a Nimitz-class carrier, and almost as wide as three of them out side by side. It absolutely dwarfed him, and yet he was about to completely wreck it, if all went to plan. Another slight turn, and they were now coming up the ramp, pushing their wrecked Drakian counterpart aside effortlessly. Reynolds waited until the barrel of the tank just barely peeked over into the loading bay before giving the order. "Fire!" Jones fired, and hell descended upon the landing pod. A few lucky Drakians were just inside the minimum range, allowing them to survive unscathed as the canisters hadn't got enough time to properly separate and cover the bay. Those who weren't so lucky never had the chance to understand what had happened to them. The tungsten pellets ripped through armor, crates, power packs, computers. Nothing was spared. Survival came only from being behind enough things that soaked up a pellet before it could get to you. Smaller explosions rippled through the loading bay, and a small fire began to spread across the walls, rapidly gaining in strength as more and more vulnerable pieces were exposed in its path. Klaxons began to blare, and the survivors were left to gaze upon the unfolding chaos. Instead, most of them chose to run for cover, in case Reynolds started firing upon them. But he had other plans. "Right, Jones, give me the megaphone. Load Sabo." Jones passed back a small portable megaphone, which Reynolds ducked down to grab. "Attention all Drakians. If you surrender your weapons, we will cease fire and allow you to repair your ship. We know where your reactor core is, and we will find out what happens when it meets a depleted uranium shell. Should resistance continue, you have 1 minute to respond." The survivors paused, presumably radioing the order onto their commander, who would then make a decision and pass it back. One stepped forwards and began to approach Reynolds' tank. General Golick's wishes to relay his intent to surrender. He asks that you order your fellow soldiers outside of the ship to cease fire. The Drakian spoke in the precise, accentless, and completely robotic English of a perfect machine translation. That was something Reynolds hated. The Drakians who'd been on Earth for a while now, they were learning to speak its languages themselves. They weren't perfect, sure, but they sounded infinitely more relatable than this robotic monotone. "We will do that. You have our permission to begin damage control now, although we will bring up reinforcements." Reynolds then made a call into the platoon radio network. "LT, they're surrendering. I am going to need some more support up here to keep them in line, just in case." "Understood. Well done, Reynolds. I'll pass that on." Feeling pleased with himself, Reynolds sat down in his turret seat. Jones lowered the gun to point at the ramp as a signal of peace. "Well, Jones, how does it feel to have fired what is probably the single most damaging shot in the history of warfare? That's gotta be a lot of space dollars gone there. I don't know what the barrel ring for mission killing a spaceship should be, frankly.